Some of you know me, a lot of you know me well. Some of you don't know me. So just a quick thought, those of you who know me would be disappointed if I came to a 30-minute presentation with, like a couple dozen slides like a normal person. And those of you who don't know me will say, well, how do you get through 207 slides in 30 minutes? And the answer is you skip through a lot of them as you go, but the rest are there for your amusement later. So we're going to go through some slides fairly quickly, but you can get the ones that we blow by too fast, by going to the AREUEA website and also to my blog. Okay, my title is Global Perspectives on Real Estate and Urban Development in a Time of Stress. And, I know that sounds a little broad. And recently, my friend John Clapp sent me an email and said, I'm looking forward to your talk, but is your topic too narrow? What about the real estate implications of colonizing Mars? And, John may have been taking a shot, I'm not sure. But I've decided to abstract from Mars and other non-Earth planets today, and we'll maybe talk about the rest of the solar system another day. All right, John Quigley. Many of you know knew him. Some knew him very well. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about John because I could easily take up the half hour and longer with that, as many other people online could. I have written a blog post, as have others, about John, and you can look at that maybe if you'd like. But I think two things that a couple of things that characterize John, aside from his personal qualities, which he's a great guy in all sorts of ways. He had an enormous breadth of interest, both in terms of subjects and in terms of taking AREUEA to a more global vision. And, I'm sure that the fact that I've done work in other countries as well as the US is, probably the main reason I was considered for the Quigley Award. So, again, you can look at the slides I don't go through later. I'm going to talk about, when I was thinking about this, what do we do? And particularly like John, I have a policy focus, and it can be public policy or business policy. And you could modify this list, but this is one way I cut the big ideas of urban development. Big picture ideas about the world, why cities exist, location within cities, the assets we have in cities, the infrastructure, including transport, how we govern them, environmental, and how they interact with the aggregate economy. And obviously, I can't talk about all of these today, but in time, I'll have a version of this that we'll talk about all 8. I'm going to basically just pick 2 today. And so today I'm going to take a little bit of time. Maybe it's a bit pretentious, but before we get into the meat of the 2 of those, I'm going to talk a bit about how we work and who we work for and where, and with a focus on the sort of policy environment. You know what in the room, if we had been sitting here 4 or 5 months ago, I think we could have ignored it. I don't think we can. And if you don't know what the you know what is, you'll find out in a moment. But I'm going to talk a bit about some stylized facts about urban and development around the world and location within cities. All right. There's the 8 big ideas. I'm going to skip through these, but John has written about all 8, and I deliberately picked just one paper about each of the 8, except 2 about assets, because I couldn't resist that, one about the real side and one about finance. And his work in any one of these areas would have been sufficient to make his reputation. Okay, blah, 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 who cares? We'll skip this. One thing I do have to mention is that anytime Oh, this is something that came to me earlier. Sheridan Titman, when he contacted me about this, reminded me of another Texas professor, George Gaw, and he was AREUEA president, I think, around 85. And I remember listening to a talk he gave at the time he was at UBC. And one of the themes of his talk was the need for AREUEA to go global. And at the time, talking about Canada qualified as going global. And I think George, who we sadly lost a year ago and lost earlier to dean things from the real estate programs, would be pleased to see how AREUEA has globalized over the last 20 years. Here's another thing that's a bit, when I got the news about the award, I was pretty stunned. And one reason is who the other award winners are. And also, I have to tell you this, who I think some of the award winners are going to be over the next 5 or 6 years. And how do you end up in a group this impressive? Well, I've got one skill set that I think I can claim without contradiction. I am a genius at picking co-authors and other people to work with. And I kind of stopped after I filled up a slide. I could fill up a couple with people that have contributed to my education and helped me along the way. And, if I've helped anyone else in a similar way, I'm pleased at that. Okay. How we work. A little bit of this will be, I'll go quickly because I think a lot of you have thought about this, but not everybody thinks about it all the time. It's worth taking a few minutes to think about how we approach studying cities and real estate. Most of us are economists. Hey, it's in the title of our association. And, so we're used to models that are rational. But the rest of the world, and in fact, we too, aren't always quite like the models. And, how we motivate ourselves, if you know the person on the left, playing Hyman Roth in The Godfather, that's Lee Strasberg, the father of method acting. And method actors are always about what's our motivation. So one question I have for is, what's our motivation? Well, if you're an economist, it's an easy answer. We're each out to maximize the present value of our lifetime net income. Oh, done and done. Although possibly there are some other motivations. And given time, I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm going to say a little bit about the one that some of us are maybe, even though we think about it, we might think it's pretentious to talk about, and that's about making the world a better place. Skip a few things. Modeling, sometimes we're simple, sometimes we're a little complex. I'm more of an empiricist. Sometimes we have to go beyond the simple models. In the pandemic, maybe we should be applying some of the models that Alvin Roth and others have given us about two-sided matching problems to think about, how we allocate scarce resources like ventilators in times when prices and markets aren't working. John Clapp and Jim Kahn and others have so convinced me that options matter that every morning when I wake up, I struggle to get out of bed because once I get out of bed, I've given up the option to get out later. And of course, networks. Why am I using PowerPoint instead of a decent piece of software? It's because of network effects. So we have lots of things we have to add to our kit of tools. But by and large, I think when we're doing policy work, you got to follow Einstein's dictum, which is everything should be as simple as possible, but not more so. Try to keep it simple. Okay, I'm going to sort of skip ahead, and you can read some of this later. I want to talk a little bit about who we work for and where they live. And, we think about cities, and there are all sorts of cities. Well, let's look at some pictures. Here's where I live now. Well, outside of it, I live in Newton. Some of you know this city well, although it might look a little dated. It's not that long ago. It's the year I left the World Bank and started at Wisconsin. You know, some of you were, I think most of you were born, but maybe not all of you. But it wasn't really that long ago. Here's Shanghai in 1990, and here's the same view today. If you think Shanghai is the only example, I do a lot of work in Korea from time to time. And by the way, Psy did not film Gangnam Style in Gangnam, but that's another conversation. But that's what Gangnam looked like when I first went to Korea, the area of Seoul south of the Han River. And this is what it looks like today. Shenzhen, you get the drift. But there are other things going on in cities. There's big divisions between rich and poor. Mumbai is an example. Some of you may have read or seen the movie, oh, I'm blanking out, about the kid winning the quiz show. Mumbai has some rough places. It also has some extraordinarily wealthy people. There's a lot of stories we could talk about this house. Some of you may know about it, the Ambani residence. And, you know, even within a city, there's some views of the same city, Lagos. The low end, the middle of the market, the upper end, the upper end. And in terms of jobs, again, the same story. Very wide dispersion. And governing these cities or doing business in them often has huge challenges, but also big payoffs. And so the question is, do we have anything to bring to the table to help businesses, governments, other agents, NGOs, and so on, do a better job? And let me sort of skip ahead here, given the time. I'd say one of the main things we have to worry about is robustness. Sometimes when we stretch models and data too far, we may get a paper that we can get in a journal. But I think one of the things you should always ask yourself if you're doing policy work is, would I put my own money on this result? Would I bet the welfare of myself and my family on this result? You know, if you are giving policy advice to businesses and governments, and you're not terrified by the prospect that they might actually do what you suggest, then you need to be in another line of work. All right. You know what in the room. I'll sort of skip over this. Some of this will be updated. I want to just sort of skip to a couple of points. You know, one is we teach people about distributions and thinking about how over time these distributions shift from early stages of exponential growth to other kinds. If we're not thinking about those shifts, we're not thinking about it correctly. And the fact that there could be cycles and waves, and this is why I'm a little bit concerned about the coming year, but we can talk about that offline. But we have lots of other things that we teach our students all the time, and then people forget, like, you know, point estimates versus interval estimates. And the models that we use, whether we're using the epidemiology models or the econ models or the hybrid models, we're losing the thread in the public discourse about the second moments. And we need to bring that back and force that into the discussion. All right, I'm going to sort of skip ahead just to the idea that if you're thinking about what's going on with the epidemic or the pandemic in the US, and you're not worried about India or Brazil or Nigeria or Mexico or start to name other countries, then you're not thinking about the fact that where's the virus going to be over the next couple of years. If it's a pandemic, then what's going on in these other countries is going to affect us, as well as any reasons we may have to be concerned about those countries on their own account. And some of these places are going to be very challenging. All right. And later I'll sort of come back to what some of these models might tell us. A little bit about, you know, looking around the world, and I don't know if you know this clip. If you ever watch John Oliver, every couple of shows, he starts talking about a country, puts them up on a map, and then starts to play with the audience about, that's not Uruguay, that's Bolivia. Nope, it was Uruguay to begin with. And you get the drift. I'll speak for my own home country. Americans, North Americans, United States, we need to learn a little bit more about geography. And also think about things over time. Think about where we fit in the world. There's roughly, ballpark, 7 billion people. If we take a circle and draw it like around here, the circle, if you can see my cursor, that I'm roughly drawing, it's about half the world's population. Notice I'm not including Australia. Australia is like a hot Alaska. I hope I've got some Australians frantically typing, oh, you son of a gun, I'm going to get you now. The basic story is, in Africa, as we'll see in a minute, over the next 20, 30 years, much of population growth and much of urban population growth is going to take place in Africa, a place that, as an institution, AREUEA has, sadly neglected, I think. And if you're thinking about the pandemic, if you really believe that there is only a few cases or deaths or whatever measures you're looking at in Africa and Asia outside of China and Japan and parts of Latin America, even though Brazil and Mexico are beginning to collect the data, then you don't know the difference between cases and measured cases. All right. Here's a graph I did from data from Angus Madison, the doyen of doing these kinds of long-run historical data. This is the size of economy measured in purchasing power parity, GDP. I know, it's a stretch to do this, but why not make an attempt? If you look back 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, then two countries dominated the world in terms of the size of their economy: India and China. North America, North America is here, Netherlands is here, UK is here, at least the area that is currently those places. You can see that India and China were the big kahunas of the economy. And then several hundred years ago, we started what's been called the Great Divergence. Why do we call it the Great Divergence? Well, the reason these are so different is all these people had similar standards of living, but there were a lot of people here. Just to sort of skip a slide to here, here's the per capita numbers. India, China, North America, UK, Europe, wherever you were, life was, as Hobbes said, brutal, nasty, and short. And it was, any way you would measure it, if you put a dollar number on it, for the heck of it, it's going to be a low number. Here's the thought experiment. Now that we're having this period of convergence after the Great Divergence, does anyone really think the US is going to remain the #1 economy, the #1 power by other measures over the next 50 years? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, let me put it this way. Before the US was #1, the UK was #1. Before the UK was #1, the Netherlands was #1. Before the Netherlands, it was Italy. Before Italy, China and so on. All right, well, let's focus on Italy, Netherlands. Is there anyone in Italy that would rather live in the Italy of when Italy was #1 or the Italy of today? Or the Dutch or the British? No, they're much better off today. So I think we need to kind of recast how we think about the world and realize that, like it or not, demography ultimately is destiny in a world where you begin to have technology, and also policies and so on with fits and starts, and ways of thinking about property and finance and so on. These things get dispersed throughout the world, and it won't be a smooth process. I don't ascribe to like an arc of history that this is predetermined or that there's a timeline on it, but I think we deal with the world as we find it. All right, I'm going to skip some of these. Recommend factfulness. I put in those of you who don't know Hans Rosling should check him out. He's got a great book with his son and daughter-in-law, and he's also very entertaining on YouTube. He's a much better presenter of this cross-country data than I am, and that's not because I'm okay. He's amazing, very entertaining, and thought-provoking. He has a little quiz. I've reproduced it here if you want to take it. If you've read the book or taken it otherwise, fine. But if not, download the slides, take the quiz. And then each one is, you got one chance in three. He mentions that, if you're a monkey and you're choosing randomly, you'll get roughly a third of them right. And it turns out that lots of people do worse than the monkeys, which means they do worse than choosing randomly because they have the wrong preconceptions about what the world is like. So check it out if you haven't. I'm going to sort of skip over some of this for time, because I want to make sure I have a little bit of time for location within cities. And I think probably everyone watching knows the Alonzo Muth-Mills model, or the standard urban model, as we sometimes call it. Sometimes the monocentric model, but that's a misnomer because eventually the model itself predicts that other centers will arise. But oddly enough, there's still a lot of central tendencies in market-oriented cities. Here's a graph from a paper by Chris Redfern looking at LA, maybe the ultimate example to many of us of a polycentric city. And that shows the employment centers that he has measured around Los Angeles using, some employment density cutoff. And you can see how dispersed that is. But not all the centers have the same density. And even in LA, like the king of polycentrism, downtown LA is still a lot denser than the other centers. In other words, there's still something going on there. And so that simple model still tells us something. Sure, it's flatter than a typical negative exponential we draw in class, but it's not random or dispersed all over the place. And there's lots of things we could add to this. I'll cut through some of this. Now, I think a lot of this has something to tell us about something that we're reading about and thinking about all the time. I constantly hear or read, is the pandemic the end of the city? Because density is going to do us in. Well, I live in a 250 unit apartment building, and I'm pretty safe. It's certainly true I haven't gotten on a train lately or an airplane. So there's lots of issues here. I'm not trying to be Pollyannish, but when you look at data that we skipped over on density, yeah, New York is the densest CBSA in the country and the one that's taken the biggest hit. But the number two CBSA is one that's got a city of 80,000 in Georgia. It's sort of a density matters, but not quite the way we usually think about it. And cities have been decentralizing. People have been leaving the city for the suburbs for centuries. Here's an old chart I did some years ago using data from Ed Mills, using his data from Milwaukee, just showing the decentralization of Milwaukee over from 1900 to about 1963, or 1880, I'm sorry. There's nothing new about this. And On the other hand, lately, before the pandemic, there was talk about back to the city, and some very interesting papers done recently. Couturin, Hanbury, Otter, others. Let me just show a quick picture from a working paper they have that I hope they don't mind me stealing their graphs or marketing their paper, depending on your perspective. But the green bars, each of the pairs of bars is a set of 10 CBSAs, metro areas. And so it's the 1 to 10 are the 10 biggest, and 91 to 100 are the, number 91 to 100 in terms of size, population. And they calculate the population growth in the central cities and in the suburbs for each CBSA. And so in 1970 to 1980, in the top 10, there was one CBSA that grew, one central city, set of central cities that grew faster than the burbs, and 9 where the burbs grew faster. And you get the drift. Between 2000 and 2010, of the top 100 metro areas, there were 2 where the central cities grew faster than the burbs, and there were 98 where the burbs were growing faster. So no overall back to the city. But wait, when you look at the college educated, you can see that, let's just focus on the, I'm pointing at my screen and that doesn't work, does it? This works better. You can see that when you're looking at college educated, the patterns very different. And you do see, especially in the largest cities. Look at Otter's recent paper that he presented a version of at ASSA about a year ago, and you'll see a very similar kind of story that you would tell, I think. And you get some other patterns when you look at within the college educated. It's the young people, especially those that are, kind of recent graduates, that are the big drivers of this. All right, so what's the story here? Story is back to the city, overstated, but there's a very important element that's been happening that's differentiated by education levels and ages by other things, among other things. But now there's still been this broad decentralization. Around the world, some of you have seen this work by Alain Berthaud before. You can see, I see we're running short on time, so I'll skip over some of this. Same kind of patterns occur. And the way I've sort of messed around and I found 2 GIFs, what can I tell you? I think the pandemic's going to be a catalyst that's going to speed up some of these processes of decentralization, but not in a completely even-handed manner. Catalyst is something that makes something that's going to happen anyway happen faster or more spectacularly, like if you throw some Mentos into a Coke, which I recommend anyone who's having lunch right now. If you don't know what happens, just drop one in and point it away from your face. All right. I'll end up on just a couple of other things because just about half hour is just about up. The story that it's just density. So here's New York. City population, I'm going to round, 9 million. 40 persons per hectare by the Berthaud measure. GDP per capita, 63,000. 1.7 billion subway rides per year. Number of COVID deaths over the last 3 months, 16,000. Well, density, transit, what could be done? Seoul, city population, 10 million. It's a city, not the broader megalopolis. Density, 322 persons per hectare, like 8 times as dense as New York. GDP per capita, roughly half New York's. Oh my goodness, I forgot to put the transit use. The transit use is, it's over a couple billion. I think it's more like 3 billion a year. And here's the other thing. If you look at this chart later, you'll see that the transit use fell off the cliff in New York In Seoul, it fell, but not by nearly as much. So Seoul, poorer city, denser city, much denser, much more transit use, and 4 deaths instead of 16,000. So, again, a big thing for us to tackle is, what this effective density is like. And that's not always going to be found in the cities, sad to say. And probably everybody's seen this picture. Or the Tavern League of Wisconsin, open immediately. I like the Tavern League of Wisconsin. They really know how to give good public health advice. All right, I'll stop here. This is, what some of the things we have to do. All right, I'll stop and Mike, I'm at your disposal. At the disposal of the group.
Thank you, Steve. We really appreciated that. I did not think you'd get through 207 slides, but you did, or pretty close to it. We have a couple of questions that I have, and from there, so there's Q&A on the right-hand side of your screen. If you just want to just write your questions there, I'll do my best just to ask Steve these questions. You will be recorded, so just be careful what you ask. But Steve, I have a first question for you. So, in your opinion, what ideas or technologies have accelerated as a direct result of COVID-19?
Obviously, a lot of them are medical technologies, but another is not just the technology itself, but the use of it, kind of a ratchet effect. And this is a good example. 6 months ago, I don't think many of us would have really thought about having a conference like this using WebEx or Zoom or whatever, or using them for classes. Suppose that, a year from now, there's a super effective vaccine and this whole thing is put to bed. I would love for that to happen. Let's just assume it for the sake of argument. How many of us are going to use these kinds of systems more than we did beforehand? So it isn't just that, it's the distinction between invention and innovation. Invention is when you come up with a new technology. Innovation is when people really use it. So certainly there's going to be pushes on the invention side in medical technology and in others, but I think a lot of it's going to be innovation in that we're going to use existing technologies much more extensively. And again, a lot of the examples I come up with, might not be immediately off the top of my head, using cell phone apps for tracking people, in an epidemic. There are other uses for those. Some I would say more socially beneficial than others. To use neutral language, we got a lot of concerns about privacy and others. So, but let me think about it some more and maybe address it when I, revise the slides. It's a great question.
Great. Well, that sounds great. So Mark Schroeder asked a question. What is effective density as epidemiologists measure it? It was mentioned in some of your slides. Are you familiar with the terminology?
Effective density? I actually haven't I should do this, and I will. I haven't looked it up in that literature. I just picked up the term as a layperson as the density of how people are actually gathered together. So, you could be in a rural area, you all show up at a Walmart or a church or a swimming pool, and even though the way we would usually measure density, say, oh, well, this is a small town or a rural area, but you're close together. Or, most some of the saddest cases, a small town with a nursing home, that's been riddled with the virus. So the effective density, the way I'm thinking about it is about how much close physical interaction and face-to-face contact there is. Actually, I'm a good example. I'm in this apartment building, and if you measure the density, it's pretty dense, but for whatever reason, I don't know that many of my neighbors. I know a few, but far fewer than I expected to. So that's a sense. It's a loose. I'm using the term loosely. An epidemiologist might have a more rigorous definition.
Great. No. Oh, well, thank you. So first, the next question is, like you talked about sustained population growth in Africa. How do we provide housing for millions of young families that are being formed there? Right, Albert Seiss.
Well, I think Albert knows the answer to this because he's got a lot of experience. There will be housing provided for them because they will live somewhere. The question is what kind of housing and what margins can we improve it, on which margins can we improve it? This is a discussion I've had with some Africa specialists who don't follow housing that much. One model that does not work and has not worked in Africa in the past is go in and build a bunch of public housing or units to Western standard. It's not just public. For example, there have been a lot of projects lately. One that comes to mind is that I'm thinking of in my mind's eye is in Angola. I could throw up a slide if I had a minute. It shows up in a McKinsey report on affordable housing as a model of here's what we should be doing, building these projects in Africa. Well, I got to tell you, you cannot afford to build those projects at scale, given the incomes of people in the countries that we're talking about. So the question is, how do you basically improve the housing that they're going to have? And sometimes at very low incomes, places like Malawi, it's about upgrading basic water and sanitation more than it is building a Western style house or apartment building. Now there's a lot longer conversation to have on that, but that's kind of a quick answer. And I'd be pleased to discuss it further offline with anybody who wants to touch base, maybe set up a Zoom or something sometime.
Oh, that'd be great. So this question by, would you be willing to offer your best guess as to the impact of the pandemic on residential property prices overall, both in the short and long term? That's by Eugene Flynn.
So I've actually been participating for several years in Zillow's survey they do of housing economists, and I'm kind of like the winner of the worst forecaster of housing prices in America, at least at Zillow surveys, because I've been thinking the market's been overpriced for a while. But if there's one thing we learned in the early 2000s, we can't find a way to pick the turning points. You know, it's kind of we don't have models or science that does that. So my best guess is housing prices could drop by 20%, but you know, there's going to be a lot of things happening that may support the market, and we don't see that much of a drop. And of course, it's going to vary a lot by metro area, you know, given supply conditions. You know, if you live in a place like San Francisco or LA, you know, those markets tend to be more volatile, as most listeners know. So I should have just said, I don't know, but I gave you an answer anyway. I gave Gene an answer.
That's great. So I mean, you know, just kind of a counterbalance though, in some sense, I think this pandemic has really taught me how much I value my house, right? I think, you know, I just remodeled a bathroom actually, you know, my spare time. And in some sense, we might see demand increase for, you know, person provided services actually increased. And I think, again, we just don't know at this stage, I think. So, no, thanks. So when comparing Seoul with New York City, do you think the age of the city played a part in the pandemic care? Seoul is relatively a new city compared to New York City, or is it more about individual behavior and policy enforcement? This is by Peter Hahn.
It's a good question, and it's another one where I have, if I was honest, I would say I don't know and move on. But I'm going to make my speculation. I wouldn't say age has nothing to do with it, but certainly age has something to do with the fact that, you know, look, I think we'd be foolish to think that the density, you know, of you know, the subway during rush hour, you know, didn't have the ability to spread infection, and that's something that you find in older cities. Well, certainly New York is kind of unique, but you know, you're not going to find many people getting sick on the Portland light rail, because here's a secret: nobody in Portland rides it. that's a slight exaggeration. Numbers, it's like, 5% of the commutes are using any kind of transit, whereas in New York, it's, from memory, I'll be wrong on this, 30 or 40%. Someone will be able to correct me. They'll know it off the top. So the point is, yeah, I think age matters, but I think a lot more has to do with the fact that it was the gateway city where people came in, people from Europe is where the virus apparently entered the US and started in New York. The density, the effective density with the subway and transit, may have played a role. But also New York's a place, honestly, I'd rather have, I'm a person somewhat at risk given my age and some other things. If you said to me, would I take my chances in New York or in a assisted living, in a small town, in a rural area in the U.S., I'd rather be in New York on the theory that if I did get it, I'd get some care. Again, there are big differentials there, as we know, by income level, race, and so on.
That was great. So just kind of, a bigger picture question. So across your lifetime of research, what contribution are you most proud?
I really am proud of the fact that I've worked with so many great people. I mean, that's not exactly the research contribution, but I think I'm most proud that when I started working on other countries, after starting off at the Urban Institute, working on the US and then moving to the World Bank, I was proud to discover that there were lots of things that we do as economists and other social scientists that transfer from one country to another, but also to find out that there were some things that don't transfer, and to begin to figure out, what those things are, what kinds of things, some basic parameters of behavior are very similar from country to country, but institutions and culture and certainly incomes and constraints, other constraints, vary hugely. And so, if there's one reason to work in a range of countries, if you have the opportunity, it's because you learn so much, not just about those countries, but about the world and about yourself.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So the last comment is, so what advice would you have for a young academic who's aspiring kind of Quigley medalist like yourself? Kind of as a parting thought, what advice would you give?
That's a hard one, because the first advice I could give would be take a detailed look at my career path and don't do that, because it was kind of crazy and not optimal in any sense. It worked for me, but that was because of a series of fortunate events. I think I wrestle with this, actually. It's a hard question, because early in your career, I'm going to be realistic. In today's world, especially as an academic, you have to publish in journals, and I think we overweight it, but we deal with the world as we find it. We are heavily invested as a field in what journal did you publish in. That must be a great paper. It was in real estate economics, not in urban studies. Well, on average, maybe is quality difference, but we spend so much time worrying about journals. And it was in Journal of Finance. Oh man, there's so many lousy papers in Journal of Finance that are never cited, and deservedly so. But we overstate that. As a young person, you need, to advise someone not to focus on that. You got to find a way to satisfy, to kind of work on things that interest you and that you think are going to make a difference. At the same time, you don't go off the rails and ignore what your mentors are telling you about what you need to do to get tenure. So I'm being realistic. At least I think.
Great. Well, thank you again for your time, and just congratulations for the medal. And this concludes this session. We'll return at 2:30 p.m. With a research panel on urban economics chaired by Dan McMillan. Thanks again, Steve.
I look forward to the panels this afternoon.